Greetings and welcome to Thinking Beyond Stereotypes in Asian American Media. My name is Keenan Colquitt. I'm the Program Manager for Diversity Scholar Engagement with the National Center for Institutional Diversity, NCID, at the University of Michigan. I facilitate programs, events, and initiatives such as the Diversity Scholars Network that are committed to advancing understandings of historical and contemporary social issues related to identity, difference, culture, representation, power, oppression, and inequality as they occur and affect individuals, groups, and communities and institutions. We are proud to sponsor this event in collaboration with the Anti-Racism Collaborative, University of Michigan Library, Asian Pacific Islander American Studies Program, Department of Film, Television, and Media, and Digital Studies Institute. On behalf of myself, NCID, and all of our sponsors, we welcome you. We begin this presentation with the land acknowledgement. The University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Three Fires Confederacy made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered ceremonially through the treaty at the foot of the rapids. Through these words of affirmation and acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. And now to our event, which is moderated by Melissa Phruksachart, PhD. Melissa. Dr. Phruksachart is an assistant professor of film, television, and media at the University of Michigan. Her book in progress, Archives of Embarrassment, Making the Model Minority of Cold War U.S. Television, interrogates racial stereotypes that have been marked as bad objects or archives of embarrassment, looking at the supporting roles, background parts, walk-on, and other sundry acting jobs that produce non-stardom. Additional essays from Melissa can be found in venues such as Film Quarterly, Camera Oscura, Feminist Media Studies, Emeratia Journal, and the Boston Review. She received her BA from Swarthmore College and her PhD from CUNY Graduate Center. Great to see Melissa. Thank you for moderating this event.
Thank you, Dr. Colquitt. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. I want to thank the NCID for giving us this platform today, and special thanks to Keenan, Janine, Charlotte, Graham, and everyone else behind the scenes at the NCID for making this event possible. I want to quickly mention that UM's Graduate Student Union, GEO, spelled GEO, has been on strike since March 29. That's 7 weeks now for a living wage. They're not asking people to cancel academic events, but they do need your support in various other ways, and you can find out more about them on Twitter at GEO3550. So moving on, we conceived of this event as an occasion to celebrate new books in the field of Asian American media and cultural studies published in the last few years. And this is important not just because the pandemic interrupted opportunities for scholars to circulate new work, but also because this coincidence of new books shows us the flourishing possibilities for the field in this decade. We are seeing new articulations of what it means to think as an Asian Americanist and what it means to study and teach media at this conjuncture. So for today's panel, I'm going to introduce each author, and then we'll give a brief 5-minute introduction to their book, and then we'll have a brief, a group discussion, and then an audience Q&A around 3:05 p.m. Eastern. So you can feel free to please put your questions in the Q&A section or in the chat. So I will introduce our first speaker, Denise Khor. So Denise Khor, PhD, is an associate professor of Asian American Studies and Visual Culture, Asian American Studies and Visual Studies at Northeastern University, where she is jointly appointed in the Department of Culture, Societies, and Global Studies and the Department of Art and Design. Her first book, Transpacific Convergences, Race, Migration, and Japanese American Film Culture Before World War II, published by the University of North Carolina Press, 2022, explores the historical experiences of Japanese Americans at the cinema and traces an alternative network of film production, circulation, and exhibition. Her work has appeared in Film Quarterly, Pacific Historical Review, Southern California Quarterly, and The Rising Tide of Color, Race, State Violence, and Radical Movements Across the Pacific, edited by Moonho Jung in 2014, among other publications. In 2019 to 2020, she was faculty fellow at Harvard University's Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History. Denise?
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and to be sharing a stage with such stellar scholars. Thanks to Keenan for organizing this forum and to Melissa for the invitation. I very much look forward to the discussion that will follow. So my book, Transpacific Convergences, Race, Migration, and Japanese American Film Culture Before World War II, reveals a broad and expansive history of alternative film practices and contexts taking shape in the United States in the early 20th century as Japanese Americans not only produced films in the era before Hollywood, but also established their own theaters and exhibition companies to facilitate the circulation of films from Japan. What I aim to reveal in my book is an expansive, wide-ranging, and global dimension to the history of the American cinema. For me, Transpacific Convergences, the title of the book, not so much names or describes a particular region or even a movement. I really see it as a kind of heuristic to rethink national cinema paradigms in film and media studies, as well as to really trouble the assumptions about cinema's technological and industrial modernity that situate the major industries of France, Germany, Russia, and especially the United States as the center for which all else is periphery. The chapters of my book are organized around categories of film production, exhibition, and circulation. And they're also built around major turning points and periodizations in film history. So silent and sound films, silent and sound film, early cinema and early Hollywood, the development of the studio system, among others. So I won't go into too much detail given the time, but you can get a little sense of what it looks like. I put the chapters here on the slide. By far, my project's most exciting archival finding is the rediscovery of the only existing print of a film called The Oath of the Sword. Produced in 1914 by a company based in Los Angeles and calling itself the Japanese American Film Company, this film is likely the earliest Asian American film with a surviving print. Next slide, please. I found this film in the archives of the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York. It has since been restored thanks to a grant from the National Film Preservation Foundation. The film, I'm thrilled to report, will have its world premiere on May 28th, just a few weeks from now at the Academy Museum. So perhaps most pertinent for our discussion today is the way that my book really tries to rethink the historiography of Asian American film and media. The genesis of Asian American filmmaking has been most centrally defined by the radical activism of the Asian American movement in the 1960s and 1970s, and the self-conscious identification with the category Asian American as a political identity. And most of you are probably very familiar with this history. By looking to the first half of the 20th century, what I reveal is an earlier, longer, and more expansive history of Asian American independent filmmaking. As early as 1912, I show that Japanese in the United States produced their own films and established what I would describe as an aspirational cinema based in the politics of racial uplift and respectability. Of course, this cinema includes The Oath of the Sword, and this film is a film about two young lovers separated when one leaves Japan to study at the University of California, Berkeley, where he becomes an incredibly popular and successful student athlete. Next slide, please. And this is a still from the trade press at the time. But the cinema that I write about also includes a number of film production companies formed by Japanese Americans, like the Yomatograph Motion Picture Company established in Portland, Oregon, and the Fujiyama Film Company established in Redlands, California. And these companies all have made various kinds of films, none of which have survived. And this is all happening at a moment when Hollywood has not yet become Hollywood, at least the Hollywood that we know it. Ultimately, what I argue is that this earlier cinema requires us to rethink the very terms Asian American and independent. This cinema was neither self-consciously Asian American nor similarly politicized by the radical movements that gave rise to post-1968 filmmaking. And while these filmmaking endeavors were independent from the dominant film industry in both the United States and Japan, Their relationship to major film institutions was not necessarily or self-avowedly oppositional. And finally, I conclude by thinking about the ways this earlier era of filmmaking and filming activity was both short-lived and limited in scope. The channels for distribution were not there. These endeavors were undercapitalized. And very importantly, the vertical integration of the Hollywood studio system foreclosed so many avenues. This is true of the kinds of filmmaking that I'm talking about. This is also true of the history of the race film industry, for instance. Alongside the devastating effects of the Second World War, what becomes evident in my view is that the fullest possibilities of this earlier era in filmmaking, while promising, would ultimately not materialize. So I think my 5 minutes is up, and with that, I thank you and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Denise. Next, we have Lori Kido Lopez. So Lori Kido Lopez, PhD, is a professor of communication arts and director of the Asian American Studies program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has published many books on the subject of race and media, including Asian American media activism, fighting for cultural citizenship, race and media, critical approaches, and most recently, micromedia industries, Hmong American media innovation in the diaspora. Her research examines the way that minority groups use media in the fight for social justice, particularly focusing on Asian American communities and media cultures.
Thanks, Melissa. So thank you so much to everyone for coming, and thanks for the invitation to be here. It's really nice to be in conversation with these other amazing scholars and learn about all the scholarship that everyone's been working on. So this book, Micromedia Industries, is a project that I started in 2014 after I moved to Madison, Wisconsin. And since I study Asian American media, I really wanted to learn more about Asian American media in the Midwest, not looking at representations of Asian Americans in the Midwest, but really who are the Asian Americans who are participating in media production within their local communities. And Hmong Americans are the biggest Asian American community in Wisconsin. And UW-Madison has a really strong Hmong studies community. So that seemed like an important area to focus on. So I started out by having kind of informal conversations with Hmong Americans about what kind of media they used and were paying attention to. And then I moved into doing more in-depth interviews with both media audiences and media producers. And I ended up interviewing around 100 Hmong Americans about media. I traveled all around Wisconsin, but also to the Twin Cities and Central California, because those are also places that have big Hmong American populations. And I learned about some of the really interesting stuff that they were doing. One of the things that really stood out to me about this extremely wide variety of Hmong American media outlets is that they were all very small. They all had to deal with their small size and scale in some way. And it struck me that Hmong media might happen to face all sorts of challenges around scaling up, but that there are tons of other Asian American media outlets that also are in a very similar situation. So I put forward this term micromedia. I define micromedia as small scale versions of media production and distribution, where these are media outlets that are, their growth is limited by barriers. So that can include staffing, funding, audience size. There's all these different factors that make it so that it is impossible for these outlets to grow and take advantage of the economies of scale that more traditional media outlets have always relied on. But I would say the most important attribute is just that when you look behind the scenes, it's just one or two people running an entire media outlet. There's not a big paid staff. It's just kind of someone working alone, or sometimes having like a handful of part-time volunteers. So this concept of micromedia industries is one of the main things that I wanted to add to the field of Asian American media studies. I wanted to make the argument that micromedia production is something that is significant in its own right, that it's not something that we should just dismiss as like too small to matter, or not to think of small media outlets as failures, like that they have just failed to become a real media outlet, or like to that because they're not constantly growing, that somehow they're just like on their way toward becoming something legitimate. And in the book, I also try to map out a bunch of the different characteristics of micro media industries. So that includes things like how their small size shapes their the workers' identities within them. So I call the people who run these media entrepreneurs, and I think it's really important that even if it's just a part-time job or something like a side hustle that someone is doing, if they're running an entire media outlet, I think we should recognize them as entrepreneurs. And I think it's important to think about the ways that they have to develop multiple kinds of professional expertise in order to run a single outlet all by themselves. I also point out how micromedia build from the authority and legitimacy of mainstream media. So sometimes it actually looks from the outside like the production value or the forms that it takes to kind of seamlessly blends in amongst legacy media. So then that's why you have to ask this question of, well, who is it behind the scenes? Because they're working so hard to make it blend in with legacy media. I also think it's important to recognize that micromedia are simultaneously vulnerable and resilient. So there's like both ways. On the one hand, a micromedia outlet could close down tomorrow because if it's just one person running it, then they might just say, I've had enough, I'm burnt out, I'm closing this down. On the other hand, even if people complain a lot about a micromedia outlet, if that one person is like, I'm going for it, I'm going to keep this thing up and running year after year after year, they also have the power to do that. I also look at how they sometimes blur boundaries between traditional media mediums and genres. So I use the term hybrid media platforms to think about how these, I saw Hmong Americans making these really innovative and new mediums or genres. One of them is teleconference radio programs, where one form of Hmong radio is that people set up a conference call. So it's an audio format that everyone can call into on their cell phones, and then that becomes a form of radio. So it's kind of blurring the boundaries between conference call and radio. And then I also look at how they provide a platform for marginalized voices that have been left out of mainstream media. So there's kind of a political idea to micromedia as well. So I think that Hmong Americans provide a really interesting site for thinking about size because they are a small ethnic community. They don't have a homeland of their own, so they can't like just use their homeland's media infrastructure to provide Hmong American media content. They kind of have to go it by themselves in the US or all across the diaspora. But all Asian American media communities struggle with size and scale because Asian Americans are a minority within the US. So in trying to legitimize and better understand these Hmong micromedia industries, I'm definitely trying to give us tools for understanding Asian American media industries on a broader scale also. So that includes thinking about how like Asian American documentaries are produced, or blogs like Angry Asian Man is a micromedia outlet, but also like Asian American food blogs or fashion blogs. Podcasts are more frequently micromedia. Many YouTubers, if they don't like join up with a big affiliate, then oftentimes the YouTuber is just one person doing micromedia. Influencers, TikTokers, Instagrammers. So anything that doesn't have a traditionally sized staff of media professionals, I'm saying I think we should look behind the scenes and ask what kinds of, what's going on behind the scenes. How are these different media outlets operating in distinctive ways, but also important ways? So I'll just wrap up there.
Thank you, Lori. Next, we have Vivian Huang. Vivian L. Huang, PhD, specializes in race and performance in the Department of Communication Studies at San Francisco State University. Vivian's recent book, Surface Relations: Queer Forms of Asian American Inscrutability, theorizes racial aesthetics and affects of obfuscation in contemporary performance, visual art, and literature. Surface Relations was awarded the Duke University Press Scholars of Color First Book Prize and is a finalist for the LGBTQ+ Studies Lambda Literary Award. Vivian's peer-reviewed articles can be found in the Journal of Asian American Studies, Diacritics, Women in Performance, and the Journal of Popular Culture.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you for gathering us. And thank you so much to Dr. Colquitt for organizing this. And thank you also to Graham and Charlotte and the NCID. And thank you, of course, everyone in attendance for making time to be here. So a sort of big picture question that my book is responding to is, how does Asian American life appear? And if it historically does not appear in popular culture, then how do we know Asian American culture when we see it, when we sense it or feel it, right? And what does it mean to become Asian American on a public stage if we only appear often through this discourse of lack? So my book, Surface Relations, Queer Forms of Asian American Inscrutability, poses these questions not to prove that Asian American cultures exist to a majoritarian gaze, but more to support spaces and times for expansive cultural life forms to take shape, which may or may not be discernible, right, as Asian American. If you are part of Asian American communities, of course, you know this story of lack or not enough to be incomplete. Our cultures exist, as of course this panel of scholars, right, know, and they are actually overwhelming in scope and depth and history. To take popular discourse at face value would be to believe not only that Asian American culture and politics are lacking, but that Asian American people themselves are to blame for not taking up more space. The pervasive discourse then of lack obscures us to the robust, inventive ways in which Asian American cultures nevertheless exist and flourish through different forms of connection, what I'm calling surface relations. The book takes up the stereotype of Asian as inscrutable other, to critique a liberal mandate to be knowable and known, to be deserving of public care. Asian American aesthetics, I suggest, point to other ways of relating and world making that are not premised on understanding or empathy. To be known, to be seen, and to be understood, of course, are common idioms for being regarded with liberal personhood. In contrast, to be unseen, unheard, and beyond understanding have been the sort of cautionary tale, right, ascribed to the mystical East. And if gender and sexual discipline have been instrumental to the knowledge projects of colonialism, then part of the threat and the potential of Asian inscrutability has been in other genealogies of knowing, becoming, and relating. My book is indebted to scholarship in women of color feminisms, queer theory, and performance studies because I'm interested in the social possibilities and the seeming negativity of Asian American cultural life. The artists that ground the book, including Yoko Ono, Basira Khan, Teching Xie, and Sun Kwang-chi, are thematized around aesthetics and affects of inscrutability, where something is missing as part of the artwork's premise, but this withheld thing actually does not ensure isolation, erasure, or social death. Rather, aesthetics of inscrutability allow for interpersonal possibility and interdependent world making through surface relations. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I study the work of contemporary Asian American artists who use performance, visual art, and literature to play with the racial aesthetics of inscrutability, which I identify in the chapters as invisibility, silence, impenetrability, flatness, distance, and withholding. Each of the book chapters tries to thicken the story around what I'm identifying, right, as aesthetic and also affective modes of inscrutability. So in the top there, right, you see Sun Kwang-chi posing with Goofy at Disneyland in 1979. And so I'm playing with this performance of distance as a sort of affective distance, as well as thinking about it in terms of him saying sort of negotiations of space and landscape photography and tourist photography, right? So thinking about distance in terms of also like diaspora. So yeah, in the book more generally, understanding or knowledge are not the goals of relation. Indeed, in the novel For Today I'm a Boy by Kim Fu, which I read in chapter 3, the author describes how the gender questioning Chinese Canadian protagonist, among a group of white, queer, and trans friends, longs for the comfort of being only partially understood. So I'm interested in how we can sort of, expand our vocabularies and modes of perception, right, for care and intimacy via performances of inscrutability. So I'll stop there, but I look forward to our discussion, and thank you so much. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you, Vivian. So our final speaker will be Mila Zuo. Mila Zuo, PhD, is an assistant professor in the Department of Theater and Film at the University of British Columbia. Her research areas span transnational Asian cinemas, film philosophy, abject epistemologies, star studies, digital and new media, and critical theories of gender, sexuality, and race and ethnicity. Her book, Vulgar Beauty, Acting Chinese in the Global Sensorium, Duke University Press, 2022, focuses on the affective racialization of Chinese women film stars, demonstrating the ways which vulgar, flavorful beauty disrupts Western and colonial notions of beauty. In addition to her scholarly work, Zuo writes, directs, and produces award-winning narrative films, visual essays, documentaries, and music videos, including Carnal Orient, 2016, and Kin, 2021.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for this lovely invitation. And many thanks to Dr. Colquitt and everyone at NCID for helping to organize this event. I'm super honored to be among such inspiring scholars and colleagues. So my book was motivated by a desire to better understand our affective attachments to racialized cinematic beauty and charisma, as well as to expand our concept of what beauty is and what it does. Of course, much has been written about the sexual objectification of women's bodies in film, and we can all think of, for example, Laura Mulvey's influential idea of the male gaze. Within a cultural studies framework, embodied beauty is often spoken about as an oppressive form of biopower. But I felt that we overlooked something about beauty's phenomenal experience a priori to its social and cultural translations, but one that might also envelop these other problems that scholars have pointed to in terms of beauty. So the book comes from trying to grapple with the complexities of encountering and identifying or disidentifying with screen beauty and screen stardom. For me, that meant understanding my own kind of suturing and splitting with global Chinese women film stars, each of whom I argue became famous at a particular historical moment because of a specific way their performativity ecstatically ruptures universal epistemes of taste. And I would just bracket here that I'm using Chinese as an unstable or flexible signifier because of the geopolitical, cultural, linguistic diversities and contestations within this identity, right, signifier. And so I'm looking more so at Chineseness as a performative mode. But staying with taste, I felt that we were missing the frames through which to unpack star beauty, and I looked to alternative productions of knowledge. Early on in my research, I came across an anecdote of the famous Chinese director Zhang Yimou describing his first impression of Gong Lee, who became China's first global film star. And we can go to the next slide, please. Here are some of the actors that I'm looking at across my research. But so Zhang Yimou describes Gong Lee as carrying a bitter, spicy flavor, or wei dao in the Chinese. And I became really interested in this idea of bodily wei dao, which we can connect to ancient Chinese cosmological understandings of the 5 elements and entanglements between language, phenomena, events, and objects in the world. Since the 5 flavors in traditional Chinese medicine is used to treat various ailments, for example, you might eat bitter to treat bitterness in the heart. I was fascinated with the idea of flavorful beauty acting as a kind of homeopathic cultural medicine to address particular social ailments. And here I'm sort of building on Richard Dyer's work on stars, in which he says that stars embody what is deemed to be the most important issues of our time. Not only do they embody these important issues, but there's something about their contradictory embodiment that seems to resolve these problems. In other words, there's something about beauty that apparently grants relief or eases our symptoms. With this paradigm in mind, I broke up my chapters and case studies using the 5 medicinal flavors: bitter, salty, pungent, sweet, and sour. And these flavors became capacious categories through which I explore how each of the stars in my book acts Chinese within the global sensorium. Next slide, please. One emergent concept that came from this framework was vulgar beauty as a way for me to express the racialized, sexualized charisma of these actors, which is always operating in entanglement within specific environments. To give one example, in my final body chapter on racial sours, I write about comedian Ali Wong and how she often wears abjection as a badge of honor. The sour in traditional Chinese medicine rebalances the liver where anger is stored. And I'm also thinking about the specific temporal structure of the sour as this signified offbeat sensation. And for me, Wong's comedy is very much about a transmutation of anger by rehabilitating the leaky Asian female body as something to revere in. And Wong celebrates the kind of obscene earthiness of her body through the lower sensorium in a very Bakhtinian way, right? And by enjoying the pleasures of the body in all its unproductive glory, she then gets across a quite novel iteration of the kind of anti-work vulgar materialism. To sum up, my book offers a new theoretical frame for thinking about our attachments to, as well as the aesthetic performances of racialized femininity as it is spectacularized through film stardom. It does so by challenging the ocular centrisms in film and visual studies and Western philosophy by demonstrating how the global sensorium is constructed across material, historical, racial, and political vectors. And in so doing, vulgar beauty thinks with and through the intimacies of tasting vulgarly beautiful bodies. Thank you very much. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Mila. And thank you to everyone for those amazing presentations. I think it really shows us the richness of what can be done when we take the minoritization of Asian American life and culture as a critical point of departure rather than our point of arrival. So now I want to invite all the panelists to turn on their cameras for a wider discussion. And so I guess I'll start off by thinking about as a way of getting to the abundance in each of your books. I wanted to start paradoxically with this idea of lack that was brought up by Vivian in Surface Relations. So Vivian, in Surface Relations, you very elegantly note that, quote, Asian visuality often circulates in its absence, lack, or disappearance, unquote. So when Crazy Rich Asians came out, thousands of articles were published online that reiterated the very same idea, this banality that Asian Americans are subject to exclusion, erasure, invisibility. And you write, quote, self-erasure becomes the primary or exclusive mode of appearance, unquote. And the mainstream media paradoxically uses this, right, as a mode of promotional visibility. And I actually think each of your books similarly challenges this conception of lack. So can you each speak to ideas like absence, disappearance, the minor or the micro as critical openings rather than as assumed foreclosures in your respective books? Because I think this is something that really connects them in a rich way. So Denise, for example, you argue that transpacific convergences, quote, traces a cinema that would ultimately not come to be, unquote. And the study of early film also necessitates that we are sometimes writing about films for which no copies exist. So can you say more about that?
Yes, I can. Thank you. That was a very beautiful question. So yeah, I mean, I think thinking about sort of loss and sort of absence and loss, I think that sort of framing has actually been very central for me, both conceptually, but also very materially. Most of the films that I write about, actually, they no longer exist. The Oath of the Sword, which I mentioned, is actually the one exception. And so Transpacific Convergences is very much a book about film without the films. And this, sort of conundrum of writing about films without films is a problem writ large of early American and international film history. The vast majority of scholarly writing on the history of cinema has been weighted towards extant films or films that we have a print of, yet 80% of films made in the silent era have been completely lost to history. And what's more is that because film preservation efforts tended to, at least historically, focus on the commercial film industry, the films that I write about were even less likely to survive. And so for me, the history of lost films has actually been a very central part in sort of writing the sort of early history of Asian American film history. I see my project joining an emerging body of scholarship engaged in thinking rather seriously about non-extant films or lost films, and thinking beyond a sort of accumulation of filmography. And I think like my book really tries to think through sort of multiple layers of loss. So we could think about loss in terms of the absence of certain films from the film canon, absence from what gets preserved. But for me, this question of loss also comes through in thinking about what happens to the cinema that I recover in my book. Sort of like, where does it go? What happens to these early film companies? And so for me, this project is also thinking within this mode of historical contingency. I'm interested in thinking about not just what is possible at a given moment and why, but also what is not possible at a given moment and why. And so, you know, sort of interesting listening to sort of Lori's sort of discussion about these micromedia industries, right? Like there is this sort of correlation here in terms of thinking about, I mean, I very much sort of understand some of the companies that I've been writing about and researching as sort of, you know, quote unquote failures, right? They didn't last very long. They're very sort of ephemeral. And yet they sort of appear at this very kind of prescient moment, right? As a Hollywood film industry is coming into being. So how do we understand that history? And how does that kind of shape or reshape this kind of conversation that we're having at this current moment around these sort of representational debates, right? The sort of question that you're sort of posing, right? Because you know, the historical frame is actually much larger than we might sort of think. So, so those are the sort of kind of things that I've been trying to think through in the book.
I can speak to this also. And thank you, Melissa, for this question, because I think the way that you phrased it, is already very instructive about how to think about it. Like, I completely agree with this framing that it was like so boring for everyone to just keep pointing out, and people do continue to point out. New studies come out all the time, just pointing out the absence of Asian Americans. And I think as Asian American media studies scholars, our work is always about being like, okay, I mean, sure, we're a minority within this culture, so of course there's going to be smaller numbers, but there are Asian Americans in media, making media, and dealing, you know, engaging with media. I think that your work, like the archive that you're looking at in your own book, is all about being like, who are the Asian Americans that were there? And that's definitely the place that I started my research on Hmong Americans in Wisconsin. I didn't think like, gosh, I wonder if all the Hmong people here are making media. I was like, I know they are. It's just that nobody has ever asked enough to find out more about that. So that was just my first question, to be like, how are Hmong people telling their stories? How are they keeping their culture alive through media? Like, I knew that that was happening. It's just something that I hadn't seen a book about. And so I was like, I guess I could write that book if I keep asking these questions. I will say that, you know, I didn't have the theory of micromedia in mind when I started it. It's that I was mapping out all these different kinds of Hmong media, and I was trying to think about this question of like, what translates beyond one ethnic group, because I think that any Asian American studies scholar could look at one ethnic community and then kind of get really deep into it. And then the question is kind of like, how does that translate for other Asian American studies scholars? And then beyond that, like, how is it going to translate for other media studies scholars and communication scholars more broadly? So it wasn't until I asked myself that question, like, what is the lesson we can learn from Hmong American media, that I was like, well, the size thing is the whole story. And I think, I hope that's helpful. I mean, it like gave me something like really meaningful that connected Hmong American media to other forms of Asian American media. So I guess it's like, I would say both things, that like, it's super important to keep asking this question, like assuming that Asian Americans are engaging with media, and just to be like, we just want to understand that better. But then to also think more broadly about, and then what does that teach us about mainstream media or like media studies questions more largely? Because I do think it's important to keep like my idea of like a healthy, robust Asian American media studies is one that works at all levels, like doesn't just like is interested in mainstream media and is interested in like what problems there are there, but then is not afraid to just like disregard that as well and ask like keep asking like interesting new questions too. Yeah, so I think like working at all those different levels is important.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to chime in. I didn't know, Mila, if you were waiting to jump in. But yeah, thank you, Melissa, for the question. And I mean, thank you to, yeah, my co-panelists, because my mind is just sitting with, you know, like some of the words, right, that we're working with around scale, around the micro, around the peripheral, and how they are getting to this question, right, about around Black and I guess what I'm writing about in my book also as, or trying to reformulate this discourse of disappearance, right, or lack around, instead around maybe like abstract figuration or other forms, right, of sensation and sensibility. So part of the self-erasure from that quote that you read, Melissa, was also thinking about the American theater, right? And the sort of romanticization of Asian women erasing themselves, right? And so that, and that sort of consolidation of both a sort of white supremacist logic in terms of, right, the Asian woman sort of erasing herself while also being part of a hetero, like biological reproductive future. And so part of what that first chapter around visuality and sort of approaching Asian American visuality from another angle and through performance and abstraction is this interest in really thinking with queer studies and performance studies, and that interest in actually, I guess, critiquing like liveness, right? And asking that question of like, okay, well, what if the sort of I don't know, colonial mandates, right, of a certain kind of personhood, a certain kind of mastery and self-testimony are not what sort of storytelling or art making is sort of trying to achieve. So yeah, sort of just trying to expand the aperture, right, in terms of what is actually out there.
Thank you so much for this beautiful question, Melissa, that draws our work together. I guess we could start with just the observation about consumption, and I'm going to quote Hegel here, and he says, you know, we taste what is disappearing, and eating is an act of destruction. You destroy the object that you're consuming, and so consumption, consuming media, all of the, I mean, this experience, the phenomenon of it is premised on ephemera and something disappearing. I think as you point out, right? And thinking with Vivian's work, who I read as I was writing my own book, and it was very formative to some of my thinking about the ways in which these women stars are not, you know, they're using these kind of minor gestures to create, you know, cryptic meaning or to create obfuscation, as Vivian's work elaborates more fully on. But I was sort of thinking about Baudrillard has a very controversial book called Seduction, and one thing that I've taken from it though is that you know, we need not always think about grabbing power or possessing mastery over a subject, but that seduction is about reversing power. It's not about grabbing at power, but it's a kind of reversal. And seduction is about the disappearance, the invisibility, the way in which an object hides itself is what is alluring, right? And so a lot of these gestures that I'm looking at in the book are these minor moments, right, where somebody's just someone's smile is a little off, or they're looking away, or their refusal to smile, or these small minor gestures are accumulating into something a bit more capacious and generative, and think about minoritarian aesthetics and pointing to this outside and these enigmas of seduction. And then finally, I would just say I'd like to think about in terms of the idea of mastering the image or anything like that is that what's more compelling is a kind of submission to beauty. What I think these stars show us is that we don't want to master or hold power over them, but that we actually want to submit, and that orients us in quite a different way towards our objects and to other kinds of practices of relating, as I think all of our panelists are pointing out here as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Something that made me really happy in putting this together was the kind of diverse sets of methods that you all bring to Asian American media and cultural studies right now. And so for those who were at SCMS in Denver this year, there was this robust conversation about the state of method in cinema and media studies. So I also wanted to give everyone an opportunity to share the methods that they bring to the table when they do their work. So, what are the methods, available to Asian American media and cultural studies? Is Asian American more of a method than an object of study? Or how can we expand Asian Americanist critique beyond textual analysis? So Lori, maybe we can start with your book because you look at industry. And so how do you see this focus on industry expanding the field? And what are some of the methods that you use to learn about this understudied community?
Yeah, thank you. Another great question. So the question about how is Asian American studies a method is kind of a big one, but I guess I would just start by saying that I think in Asian American studies, scholarship is always concerned with issues of power. It's kind of like the cultural studies approach too, so it's always about like thinking about oppression, thinking about marginalization, thinking about social justice. And I think that actually is kind of why textual analysis of representation becomes banal so quickly, because you kind of just end up asking these same questions over and over again, like how do representations contribute to anti-Asian racism and oppression? And then you could like ask that in many different flavors, but the answer is just like, this is how. And then like maybe there's the opposite question, like what kinds of representations do we see that are progressive and activist? This is how, but that's just repeating the same question over and over again. And I think that part of being a good Asian American studies scholar is actually being aware of all of the Asian American studies scholarship that has come before and all of the work that has already happened to answer those questions and to give us like really robust frameworks for thinking about how Asian American representation is both harmful and there are like progressive opportunities within it. So if we are all aware of how much scholarship has already asked those questions and answered them, then I think the question is like, what new do we have to add to textual representation or textual analysis? So that's the question I'm always asking, and why I end up being like, so I'm not going to do any more textual analysis and I'm not going to do any more representational studies. I'm going to do something else. And then we turn to like the media studies repertoire, and then it's like, well, the other things are looking at audiences and looking at industries. Or actually it's about kind of like bringing them all together. I think like for me in my own work, the most exciting kinds of questions that I ask are ones that demand looking at all of those different components together. This is why I do a lot of interviews. I try to like do a lot of field work where I like get out into the world and like see sites where media production is taking place, or where like I'm like engage with audience members to like see like how they're understanding texts. I try to like bring in all those other components so that it's not just a straight up like I watched a movie and then I asked if it was racist or progressive. To me, that's a very limited question to be asking. So I think in my look at industry, I was trying to say like there are Asian American media industries we haven't given a lot of attention to because they're too small. So if we get out there and do like interviews, participant observation, field work, those are all ways that I thought that I was getting like a richer understanding of Asian American media cultures more broadly, instead of just staying at that level of representation.
Would anyone else like to take on this question of method?
I can chime in. So yeah, I think for me, I think because, I'm sort of thinking about this kind of like, this sort of early history. And in many ways, I'm writing this sort of history, as I mentioned, in which, there is no film text to look at really. And so it sort of necessitated me to kind of sort of look beyond the screen as a kind of methodology. And so I worked a lot in sort of archives. I looked at a lot of, and I had to really, and there are sort of models in film and media studies that, look through, for instance, like the trade press and things like that. But again, the sort of history that I was writing, it's not actually represented in those kinds of archives either, at least not very sort of robustly. So I really had to kind of, in many ways, like create my own archive. So I looked a lot at newspapers by Japanese Americans at the time period, archival collections that were created by institutions like the Japanese American National Museum, and I think it's very much sort of ode to the kind of archive keeping and sort of kinds of institutions that have been committed to trying to sort of think about the history of Asian American communities. And my own sort of methodological approach, I think, has been really shaped actually by the kind of extraordinary scholarship that emerged out of the study of early Black cinema and the race film industry. I mean, it was really through that work, folks like Jacqueline Stewart, right? Like when I read her book, when I was thinking about this project, I was like, oh my God, you can do that. And it was, and so that really provided that model for me of like how to do the kind of, to ask those kinds of questions, to work through those kinds of archives, and also to really think about a kind of alternative system of film production and circulation and exhibition. And so that was something that, I think it provided the tools by which to do that. And so that is sort of that really sort of shaped my own, this book.
Vivian or Mila, do you want to chime in?
Vivian, do you want to speak first? Okay. Oh, well, yeah, I hear Lori's sort of fatigue over the good and bad image debate, and I agree. I mean, it is difficult to talk about representation and to create new methods with textual analysis. And I think that for me, trying to create or think of a new frame, I really wanted to put the racialized body back into aesthetic theory. So the book is quite theoretical. And, as such, I think my main methodology is to elevate non-Western epistemologies or vernacular ways of knowing, like traditional Chinese medicine or other cosmologies into and putting them into conversation with continental philosophy, not necessarily kicking out continental philosophy or completely taking that away, but actually seeing the resonances across and having them speak to one another, right? These discourses. But when thinking about just the flavors themselves, I really wanted to honor the materiality of these things, and not just think about them metaphorically, but allow for a kind of critical slide between the metaphorical and the philosophical, or the material and the discursive. And so I will allow my framework to really veer into some really interesting random terrain. Like what does it feel like to taste a sour fruit for the first time, and how can we take from that, right? And that kind of experience, what can we take from that and to expand it, to think about time and to think about the offbeat. And I talk about, just with sticking with that example, I guess, when babies, there's a lot of YouTube clips of babies eating lemons for the first time, and they're just kind of shocked. And it's just this immediate experience. And they don't really know how they feel about it until, the judgment comes later. But what I want to stick with is that shock. And what I try to suggest is that a lot of these women stars rupture, they bring a shock to the system, to dominant forms of dominant or conventional ways of thinking about gender or sexuality or race. So yeah, I guess my method is to just be very open and allow all forms of knowledge to become useful and to elevate, other ways of knowing that haven't been privileged, I guess, in Western philosophy. And
I can respond briefly, and I feel like I could listen to Mila talking about those lemon videos and read because I enjoy that passage so much. Yeah, so in terms of method, my work is so indebted to what I think, right, can be assembled around like minoritarian performance scholarship. And so, I think about how Jose Munoz, right, like writes about Marga Gomez, or how Karen Shimagawa writes about Ping Chong's work. And so it's really about a sort of staying with, a sort of lingering, right? Like Christina Leone or Josh Guzman write about, or like a listening with image, right? And like Tina Camp says. So it's really in a sort of tradition, maybe of like reparative reading, like Yves Kasofsky, Sedgwick. Yeah. So just trying to make connections and find ways of relating across texts that might be surprising or confusing, and just trying to pursue that intellectually.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So I have so many more questions, but we also have many questions from the audience as well. So I'm thinking maybe we can just move to those, if that's okay with all of you. So the first question is for Lori. It's from Ray Wong, and it says, Dr. Lopez, what sort of audiences do micromedia productions seek to attract? What are the ways that films are seen, theatrical, streaming, et cetera? Are there some noteworthy breakthrough examples or successes that you can share?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So I think I would say that micromedia target micro audiences. So that, I was looking at Hmong American media productions that are mostly interested in Hmong American audiences. Sometimes that meant they were in Hmong language, which is like a very targeted, limited form of engagement. Of course, it's just for Hmong people. Sometimes it wasn't English. Like I did look at some YouTube videos and podcasts that were in English, and there are some Hmong American influencers who are obviously, like all influencers are trying to grow to reach other audiences. So sometimes they were like trying to reach non-Hmong audiences, but I guess like the other thing is I would say that there's also a satisfaction with that not all Hmong media producers are trying to make it to the mainstream. So there's a sense of contentment, like this is the boundaries of the project that I am making. I'm making like a news show, and it's going to this Hmong American audience to make sure they feel seen and validated, and like their stories are being told, and that doesn't need to become like, I'm not trying to like make it onto CNN or something. So that limit is kind of like answers the other part of the question, like, are there Hmong breakout movies? Like, no, there aren't. And actually movies didn't really, like films didn't exactly fit into my micromedia model. So I didn't actually look at film production or movies. Even the concept of TV was like really hard to think about on the micro level, because TV also takes a huge crew. There are Hmong TV shows that are just made by one person, among TV stations that are only run by one person. So TV is harder, but doesn't fit film. You can imagine like a student film being made by one person, but really like a narrative feature film is going to demand a pretty large crew, even if it's like 20 people. That's not exactly the micromedia that I'm talking about. So I didn't look at movies, but there are not Hmong American breakout films. Like if you have a Hmong American Film Festival, it's not like they're going to move from that Hmong American Film Festival to like Sundance or something. And Hmong American feature films are not going to be shown in your like neighborhood Cineplex or multiplex. So the only representation that we ever see breaking through is of Hmong American individuals who reach a certain level of fame, like there's a Hmong American news anchor or like Hmong American gymnast or whatever, not even media personalities. That's the only thing that we see, which is why I kind of thought that the Hmong American media ecology was pretty unique in being so resolutely contained.
And if I can add to that, something that I learned, that I found really interesting from your work is that there isn't necessarily a kind of like, main Hmong media industry like back in Southeast Asia that they are connected with. So actually, the Hmong American media, micromedia industry, actually serves as kind of like the main hub for people in the diaspora all over the world. So I thought that was, that was really fascinating to know the way in which like the Americanness of it can become, like a bit overdetermined for people all over the globe. Okay, we now have a question for Denise. It says, Dr. Khor, have you had a chance to study the restored film that you described? If so, did it expand your understanding about what these early lost films might have been like? And I'm excited to know as well what this film is like.
Yes, I did. So it was, so I had actually assumed that for the most part, I would just be writing this entire book without films at all. And in fact, it was only really through a kind of, I don't know, it's just like the grace of God or something that, I had sort of sent out, this sort of list of films that I had sort of identified that were made during this time period. And I got a call that basically they had found one. It was actually Ned Comstock at USC who said, I think I found your film. And it was at the George Eastman Museum, and I was able to see it in 2016 on a flatbed. It's in very sort of precious condition. And so, you're sort of like watching it frame by frame. And I wrote the entire book, having only seen it once, that one time. And so it's taken up until this point to be able to get to this point where, we're able to have the film print essentially, and which will eventually premiere in Los Angeles. So, but the film is, something that, it sort of features this character Masao, who, and Hisa, these two lovers who are in Japan, and they essentially have to say goodbye. Masao, wants to study abroad in the United States, and he actually goes and studies at the University of California, Berkeley. So, the film shows him essentially like, becoming this very sort of popular student. He's like this track athlete, and he, he's really sort of quite a success essentially at the American University. He returns to Japan, at which time Hisa has had another man's baby, and there's a fight, very, very sort of dramatic fight at the end, where Masao returns this man to the ocean, but not before Hisa has committed the oath of the sword. So she's committed suicide. So, in many ways, the film sort of reproduces this kind of Madame Butterfly trope. So it's actually interesting, Vivian, you were sort of mentioning the sort of the death of the Asian woman, right? So there, that story is like very there, but I also write about how the film really has this sort of like racial uplift narrative, and similar to some of the kinds of race films of this sort of era, right? This sort of like focus on education as a sort of vehicle for racial progress. And certainly these were the kinds of conversations that Japanese Americans were having at the time, particularly as a kind of anti-Japanese movement is sort of emerging. And one response, right, was that kind of politics and respectability. So I try to think about the film not so much with just like our own sort of present day kind of kinds of lenses, but I really am sort of trying to think about it within its historical context. I'm trying to think about it in relationship to historical audiences. And so that's sort of how I sort of think about the film, and situating in relationship to a number of other films that were there, film companies, film activities. There was a major protest at this time period around a film called The Cheat. So really kind of thinking about the kind of sort of media landscape, right, of Japanese Americans during this time period, their location in Los Angeles in relationship to Hollywood, et cetera, et cetera. So I could go on, but that's sort of how I think about it.
Could I ask you one follow-up question?
Yeah.
So does the film kind of reflect a gender politics that seems more akin to what would have been going on in like contemporary Japanese film culture? Or is it really using this Madame Butterfly narrative more to like in a more kind of Western context?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I do think that it does reflect a certain kind of gender politics. I mean, I sort of write about how, right, this sort of way in which, I write about how essentially Masao is kind of like remade as this sort of new American, right? Sort of his like, kind of success, right? This sort of, sort of success and striving story is really placed within him and not, he's in some sense of this very static figure. In fact, and throughout the film, she's often just pictured with the sword behind her. It just stays with her. And so he is this sort of dynamic character who sort of transforms. He, leaves Japan, he goes abroad, right? And she, is sort of static and she stays in Japan. And so I think that sort of Madame Butterfly kind of context really sort of encases her in many ways. So I do think that it's, and I think it does sort of represent the sort of gendered politics of the Racial Uplift Project in many ways, right?
Thank you. Okay, so now we have a question for Vivian and Mila from Brittany Gentry. Brittany writes, "Thank you so much to all panelists for such an exciting discussion. It's definitely valuably expanded my summer reading list. I hope this question is useful to all, but is especially directed toward Dr. Huang and Dr. Zuo. I feel that all of these exciting new works offer a really interesting entry point into considering how surface illegibility produce media value. I'm thinking especially here of Dr. Huang's formulation of inscrutability. Is hyperlegibility or overlegibility that which produces stereotypes that then generate a dearth of meaningful visibility in visual cultures and in racial formation?"
Oh, thank you. Maybe I can start, but Mila, feel free to, maybe one way in which if I'm understanding this question in the spirit that it's posed is, maybe so an example of like Crazy Rich Asians, right, would be maybe like a hyper legible, right, sort of text anyway. And yeah, I think that think that can be true, right? That, you know, one sort of breakout or mainstream film success can sort of obscure or maybe check off a box, right? Of like, oh, okay, well, there's the one sort of Asian American film, right? But I think yeah, but I think in my book, right, I'm interested in and so I'm interested in actually how Asian American cultural forms and Asian Americanist critique, right, can actually just make us like actually deconstruct, right, the ways that we sense out, right, each other um and can identify, right. So uh so sorry, I think this question is kind of confusing me, but Mila, do you want to jump in? Maybe I'll form some thoughts.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and take a stab here. I guess, yeah. Well, first of all, I want to point to Melissa's article on Crazy Rich Asians and thinking about the the term boba liberalism. I think, if I'm not butchering that, Melissa, boba liberals. This kind of inscription of sort of neoliberal value through the hypervisibility of the film, right? And the costs of that kind of hyper legibility, to use your term here. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think Vivian's right in that, when something like that comes out, it seems to eclipse everything else and just becomes like the dominant narrative or the master explanatory device for whatever racial melancholia or whatever. I don't know. So there is definitely the risk of the kind of Asian American oversaturation, I guess, in the sense that it becomes, this monolithic narrative, or it just will prevent people from seeking out other forms of Asian American media and micromedia, to use Lori's term, right? Or to look at the lost archives of Asian American production, as Denise's work points out. So that's I guess as someone who has looked at popular culture and what could be called hyper legibility, though I guess I always want to suggest that there are ways in which the actors themselves are more agential than we perhaps might give them credit for, and that there are moments where they are also engineering some kind of subversion within a dominant text. And I wondered that there's a kind of winking going on that's taking place even within these pop cultural texts, right? Yeah, hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, Vivian, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just say, yeah, I guess one avenue in which I've written about pop cultures and thinking about like Marie Kondo, right? Who's also gained, right, like certain legibility and sort of global presence, right, or familiarity. And so, yeah, I think that, I'll just echo what Mila is drawing to, which is, yeah, the sort of star agency, right, that can still occur, and also maybe encourage people to pivot, right, or to draw connections and juxtapositions. And then, of course, there's also, I mean, I'd be curious, Lori, right, like from the industry standpoint, right, of like, okay, well, just the proliferation in a sense, right? Or maybe other ways in which other Asian American, media is being actually supported now and financed in a way that maybe it wasn't before. So there's also the material aspects of this influence.
All right, so our next question is to Mila from Jessie Yoon. And Jessie asks, Professor Zuo, can you tell us more about each flavor how you got into this idea of taste as something exceeding the visual or optics, and how do you connect taste to seduction and desire? And I'll, kind of selfishly add that, like, can you also like tie this into your, insertion or intervention about Chinese cosmology as a critical framework here? Because I think that's such a fascinating and like bold intervention that you're making.
Thank you. Thanks, Jessie. Hi. Yeah, I can try. I hope I'm not forgetting how to talk about these things, but I just started really with that description of Zhang Yimou describing Gong Lee as spicy. And I thought that was so interesting, but I thought there was more to uncover there. I started to think about spicy bitterness in a historical way first. So I started with the bitter, and just in Chinese, during the Cultural Revolution, there was a lot of emphasis on speaking bitterness and recounting the kind of traumatic histories within families that occurred before communism saved China. And the eating bitterness is a part of the kind of work ethic discourse as well. And I just saw that Gong Lee throughout her early films was really embodying a very eroticized ressentiment, right? That was trying to tackle these traumatic pasts, but there was also this kind of erotic pivot and sensualized spectacularization of bitterness. So I was just thinking, right, about like what Nietzsche wrote about bitterness and how we can connect that through to this kind of Chinese cosmology of thinking about bitterness and what the bitter flavor can do to treat a bitter heart. And just really, again, thinking about the medicinal ways in which we can regard beauty and stardom as addressing some kind of ailment at that particular historical moment. And so I think Chinese cosmology also just then allows me to think about entanglement, right? And there's such interesting work about quantum entanglement. And I'm not trained in quantum physics, but there are resonances in this kind of Chinese cosmology where everything's related to everything else, and in this holographic paradigm or in this fractal way. And so when we are looking at an image of a star, we're consuming her body alongside the things that she's wearing, the kind of the flies that are circulating, or whatever animals are around, the landscape. And so to try to think about these things aesthetically through taste, I guess helped me anchor the kind of the aesthetic experience or the perception. And so I won't go through each flavor in depth because I don't want to take up too much time, but bitterness led me to saltiness, and I was looking into what's been written in alchemical psychology about salt as being this post-bitterness form of embodied wisdom, and thinking about how saltiness is about dosage and about just the right amount. So I was looking at sort of Maggie Chung and is it Joan Chen? Now I'm sort of forgetting, but how it's about the right amount of kind of racialized, sexualized representation or embodiment to help mediate representations or visions of liberal multiculturalism in the Cold War moment. From saltiness, I go to pungent, and really how the vision of liberal multiculturalism in the early 90s turns into something a little bit more rancid. There's more skepticism and hostility towards the notions of liberal multiculturalism and hospitality towards non-whites, and so I look at the Crow and Bai Ling as a kind of pungent figure, while also looking at Ang Lee's film, Love Caution. From bitterness, or from pungent, I then go to sweetness and talk about how sweetness actually and I look at how Taiwanese stars, Xu Qi and Vivian Xu, who are being asked to play along with these hardcore nationalist ideologies of the in One China films that promote the kind of idea that Taiwan and Hong Kong have to return to China, how they're involved in these propagandistic films, and sweetness I'm thinking about as a mode of romance and heteropatriarchal status ideology, and how they actually over sweeten their roles into these campy subversion of these ideologies. And finally sour, which I talked about a little bit in terms of comedy and transforming anger, right? So yeah, I hope that answers it without going too far into it. I know we're running out of time.
Thank you so much. Okay, so for our last question, I wanted to think about this notion of care and community and the way that these books kind of function out in the world. And so I just want to pose this to Lori and Vivian, because both of your books study communities or artists or thinkers who are oriented towards survival and care. So Lori, in your book, you had this commitment to writing legibly such that Hmong American communities could actually use your book. So I wanted to ask, what was that process like? What did it teach you? You know, what has the community reception been like? You know, have you thought about other modes of disseminating your research? And for Vivian, you know, surface relations is, you know, really compassionately sits with and articulates so many of these bad Asian American feelings that often just get called like racism. And so I wanted to sort of briefly share one of my favorite sentences from your book, from the intro, when you mentioned that MIT calls a Korean American applicant, quote, yet another textureless math grind who looked like 1,000 other Korean kids, unquote. And you write that, quote, such evacuation of Asian American feeling reveals public neglect of Asian American life, care, and well-being, unquote. And I really wanted to thank you for that sentence and for the sense of care and presence and being with that you bring to this book. So I guess I want to ask, how would you communicate this, you know, this sentiment to the growing number of like reactionary Asian Americans who are divesting from or who were never invested in, you know, coalitional politics or affirmative action, and who are instead reinvesting in the carceral state? So in other words, how or can we, you know, should we move from like hate to care or something along those lines?
Yeah, I could start. I will say that having a book come out during the pandemic it's like, if a book comes out during a pandemic, is there a book at all? Like, it felt like, you know, everything was just kind of like low key. I couldn't like, yeah, I had big ideas about being able to kind of like celebrate the book in community, but they're just like, I hadn't, this was not a digital project in any way. And so for me, I had more aspirations to do more in community around the book than was possible in the middle of a pandemic. But I will say that I have participated in like radio interviews about the book, which I feel like is like very like non-academic, like just trying to like go on like the local radio station. And one of those interviews that I did about the book, I actually invited somebody else from a Hmong radio station to do the interview with me. It was someone that I featured in the book. And so I knew they were like comfortable speaking on radio. It seemed like a really good way of doing that. And then I've also like been on Hmong radio shows. So I feel like that's like sort of like the kind of model that I wish I had been able to do more, is to think about like, because I was looking at Hmong media, then participating in those forms of discussion made sense. And there, like when I had opportunities to do so, I did. But beyond that, I feel like there's still like a lot more thinking that I would like to do about what it means to translate academic works for public audiences outside of just like the standard, like turn it into like a news article that's written in more legible language. I try to write my books in legible language, but I think that's like a puzzle that I haven't quite cracked yet. So I am curious about any other ideas that other folks have for how we translate our academic ease into something that like my mom can understand and then like the subjects of my books could understand, and just like non-academic audiences would I be interested in at all.
Yeah, thank you so much for your careful, like sitting with my book, Melissa. I feel really moved by your attention. Listen to your question. I was thinking about how so much of this book was written while I was working at predominantly white institutions that did not have formal ethnic studies programs. And that really informed, right, the kind of teaching I was doing, the kind of, campus service I was doing, how I was interacting with local Asian Americans, right? And also reflecting on my own racial positioning. So simultaneously, right, advocating and insisting on institutional support for Asian American studies, for ethnic studies, and also, right, not wanting institutional legibility and recognition to be the end of, right, any sort of political or intellectual project. And so also simultaneously, right, wanting to keep open our imaginations and an active agitation for what does like interdependent world making look like, right? That's not taking for granted who Asian American studies is actually hailing as a subject, right? So the sorts of, the care that I'm trying to espouse and practice in the book is in trying to write in some ways, right, to my Asian American, like queer and trans students, who both felt the struggle of not feeling seen in their racial specificity, at the same time as they were very actively and are very actively, right, organizing along a people of color, right, sort of banner and platform. And so that was part of the tension in both, right, negotiating racial legibility and the resources that legibility, can bring about, at the same time as not wanting to cohere or sort of deaden what the utility of an Asian American identity would be.
Thank you so much. So I think that brings us to the end of our event. Keenan, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much to everyone. This has been a fantastic presentation and discussion. Thanks to all of our panelists, Dr. Phruksachart for moderating. Please complete the post-event survey at the end of this discussion and continue our conversation online with the hashtag NCID anti-racism, and follow us on Twitter at UMISH-NCID. Thank you very much to the production team and all of you for being here. This has been fantastic. Thank you.